The first bullet tore through the wooden door of Weaver's General Store, just inches from where Winifred O'Malley stood frozen, her trembling fingers clutching the letter that had brought her all the way from Boston to Sonora, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1885. The second shot splintered the glass behind her, sending sharp fragments cascading across the wooden floor like deadly raindrops, one slicing across her already scarred cheek as screams erupted throughout the store. "Everyone down!" a deep voice commanded as the store's patrons scrambled for cover. Winifred dropped to the floor, her heart pounding wildly against her ribs. This wasn't how her new life was supposed to begin. After surviving the fire that had claimed her parents and left half her face and neck scarred with angry red welts, she had scraped together every penny to answer Winston Carmichael's advertisement for a mail-order bride. His letters had been kind, promising a new beginning on his cattle ranch outside Sonora. But when she'd arrived by stagecoach just hours ago, instead of the warm welcome she'd imagined, she'd found a hastily scribbled note at the hotel stating he'd made other arrangements after seeing her step off the stage. The shooting outside intensified as Winifred pressed her body against a barrel of flour, her travel-worn blue dress collecting dust. A man in a worn leather vest crawled toward her, his hat pulled low over intense eyes. "Stay down, madam," he whispered, his voice like gravel. "Bank robbers. They'll pass through soon enough." Through the shattered window, Winifred could see men on horseback firing randomly into the air, sending the townsfolk scattering like frightened quail. The man beside her drew a revolver from his holster, his movements precise and confident. "I'm Sheriff Keenan Kent," he said, offering her a quick nod before returning his attention to the chaos outside. "Welcome to Sonora." When the gunfire finally ceased and the outlaws had galloped away, Winifred discovered they'd stolen her small travel trunk from the boardwalk where the stage driver had left it. Everything she owned, her mother's locket, her few remaining clothes, the carefully saved $23 sewn into the lining of her spare dress, all gone. Standing in Sheriff Kent's office later that afternoon, Winifred tried to maintain her composure as she reported both her stolen belongings and Winston Carmichael's abandonment. "I'm afraid I have nothing left, Sheriff," she said, keeping her scarred side turned away from him by habit, "and Mr. Carmichael has declined our arrangement." Sheriff Kent leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes the color of a summer storm. He was a formidable man, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples. A thin scar ran from his right eyebrow to his jaw, evidence of his own encounter with violence. "Carmichael," he repeated, his expression darkening. "Winston Carmichael from the Double Circle Ranch?" Winifred nodded, clutching the rejection note in her gloved hand. "That worthless snake," the sheriff muttered, rising to his feet. "Pardon my language, Miss O'Malley, but that man has pulled this stunt before, brings women out here, then rejects them once they arrive." His eyes softened as they fell on her scarred profile, though his excuses are usually less visible. Winifred flinched, instinctively raising a hand to cover the right side of her face. 3 years had passed since the fire, yet the pain of others' reactions still cut deeper than the flames ever had. "I understand if you need to send me back east," she whispered, "but I've no money for passage." Sheriff Kent's expression shifted, indignation replacing the pity she'd grown to despise. "Send you back? Miss O'Malley, Sonora may not look like much, but we're not in the habit of abandoning folks who've been wronged." He crossed to a small stove in the corner and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Besides, we have laws against false advertising and breach of contract in the Arizona Territory. Carmichael owes you compensation at the very least." He handed her a steaming cup. "In the meantime, Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house always needs help with cooking and cleaning. It's honest work that comes with room and board until we sort this out." Winifred accepted the coffee with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'm not afraid of hard work." His eyes met hers, lingering on her scars without the usual revulsion. "I believe that, Miss O'Malley. Something tells me you're made of sterner stuff than most who pass through Sonora. By nightfall, Winifred was settled into a small attic room at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, exhausted but grateful. The elderly widow had accepted Sheriff Kent's explanation without comment, merely nodding at Winifred's scars before showing her to her quarters and explaining her duties. Breakfast at 5, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, Mrs. Holloway stated matter-of-factly. Sheriff Kent paid your first week's board from his own pocket, so don't you worry about that for now, Winifred gasped. He did, but I must repay him. Mrs. Holloway waved a dismissive hand. Keenan Kent's been looking after this town since he pinned on that badge 5 years ago. It's just his way. She paused at the door. Get some rest, child. Tomorrow's soon enough to start earning your keep. Alone at last, Winifred unpinned her hair and gingerly touched the fresh cut on her scarred cheek. The looking-glass on the wall reflected a woman she sometimes barely recognized, honey-brown hair framing a face that was both beautiful and ruined. The left side remained untouched by the fire that had consumed their Boston home, with clear skin and a bright hazel eye. The right side told another story, with rippled scars extending from her temple down her neck and disappearing beneath her high collar. She'd learned to arrange her hair to partially shield the damage, but there was no hiding the truth in the harsh light of day. Winston Carmichael's note had said it plainly. I require a wife who won't frighten the children we might have. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she tucked the cruel note into her reticule. Tomorrow she would begin again. Tonight, she would allow herself this moment of grief for the life she'd imagined and lost. Sheriff Kent rode out to the Double Circle Ranch at dawn the following day, the spring air crisp against his face. The ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime grazing land, with a white-painted main house visible from miles away. Winston Carmichael had arrived in Arizona Territory 10 years earlier, with Eastern money and grand ambitions, quickly establishing himself among the territory's cattle barons. The ranch hands watched warily as Kent dismounted in the yard. A tall man with carefully groomed whiskers emerged from the house, his expression souring when he recognized the visitor. Sheriff Kent, Carmichael said, making no move to invite him inside. What brings you out here so early? Kent removed his hat, holding it before him like a shield against the urge to drive his fist into the man's smug face. I've come about Miss Winifred O'Malley, the lady you invited to Sonora under false pretenses. Carmichael's expression hardened. There was no deception. I advertised for a wife, not a... He stopped himself, perhaps seeing the dangerous glint in Kent's eyes. Not a what exactly? Kent asked, his voice deadly quiet. Clearing his throat, Carmichael adjusted his fine vest. I have certain standards, Sheriff. Any man would. She wasn't what I expected. She survived a fire that killed her parents, Carmichael. Those scars represent courage most men would envy. Be that as it may, I've already made other arrangements. A suitable young woman from Santa Fe arrives next week. Carmichael's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Miss O'Malley is free to find employment or return east. I recommend the latter. Sonora has little use for damaged goods. Kent's hand twitched near his holster. Miss O'Malley arrived yesterday with a contract signed by you, promising marriage in exchange for her journey west. You'll honor that contract with appropriate compensation for her expenses and distress. Carmichael laughed. Or what? You'll arrest me for changing my mind. Good luck with that, Sheriff. The territorial judge arrives next month for circuit court, Kent replied evenly. I'm sure he'd be interested in this case of fraudulent correspondence and breach of contract, not to mention how the good people of Sonora might react to learning how you treat vulnerable women. The rancher's face darkened. Are you threatening me? I'm explaining the law, Mr. Carmichael, and suggesting you might wish to avoid the public embarrassment of a trial. Kent replaced his hat. I'll expect you in my office by noon tomorrow with fair compensation for Miss O'Malley. $200 should cover her losses and provide a new start. 200, Carmichael sputtered. That's highway robbery. It's justice, Kent corrected him. and considerably less expensive than a lawsuit and the damage to your reputation." He mounted his horse with fluid grace. "Noon tomorrow, Mr. Carmichael. Don't make me come looking for you." As he rode away, Kent considered the woman waiting in town. There had been something in Winifred O'Malley's eyes that had struck him, not just beauty or determination, but a quiet dignity that resonated with something deep within him. He had seen how she tried to hide her scars, turning her damaged profile away from his gaze. Yet in the brief moments she had looked directly at him, he had glimpsed strength that went far beyond physical appearance. Back in Sonora, Winifred was already proving herself invaluable to Mrs. Holloway. By midday, she had prepared a hearty stew for the boarders, swept the entire first floor, and begun mending a pile of torn linens. Her nimble fingers worked the needle with practiced precision, each stitch neat and even. "You've got a gift, girl," Mrs. Holloway observed, settling her considerable bulk into a rocking chair. "Where did you learn to sew like that?" "My mother taught me," Winifred replied, her voice softening at the memory. "She was a seamstress for one of Boston's finest shops. I helped in her workroom from the time I could hold a needle." The older woman nodded approvingly. "Useful skill out here. Might even set up your own business someday." Winifred looked up, startled by the suggestion. "My own business? Why not? Sonora's growing. Got almost 800 souls now, and not a proper dressmaker among them. Women order their finery from Tucson or even San Francisco. Man who owned the dry goods store used to do alterations, but his eyes are failing." The idea took root in Winifred's mind as she continued mending. She had always assumed her future lay in marriage, especially after the fire had diminished her prospects in Boston society. But here in the Arizona territory, perhaps different rules applied. Perhaps she could build something of her own. The boarding house door swung open, interrupting her thoughts as Sheriff Kent filled the doorway, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Mrs. Holloway," he greeted the landlady. "Miss O'Malley, may I have a word?" Winifred set aside her sewing, suddenly conscious of her plain work dress and loosely pinned hair. "Of course, Sheriff." They moved to the small parlor, where Kent declined Mrs. Holloway's offer of coffee. Once they were seated, he wasted no time delivering his news. "I visited Carmichael this morning. He'll be bringing compensation for your troubles tomorrow, enough to cover your lost possessions and provide a start here in Sonora, if that's what you wish." Winifred's eyes widened. "How did you manage that?" A small smile played at the corners of Kent's mouth. "Let's just say I helped him understand his legal and moral obligations." "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "No thanks necessary. It's my job to uphold the law." He hesitated, then added, "and to ensure decent folk aren't taken advantage of." Their eyes met, and Winifred felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. For perhaps the first time since the fire, a man was looking at her truly, looking at her without pity or revulsion. "Mrs. Holloway tells me you're quite the seamstress," Kent continued, breaking the moment. "Old man Jenkins at the dry goods store is looking to retire. His eyesight's getting too poor for fine work. Might be an opportunity there if you're interested." "I was just considering something similar," Winifred admitted, "though I haven't the means to purchase a business." Kent leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Jenkins mainly wants someone to take over the alteration and repair work. Might let you set up a corner of his store for a percentage of what you earn. Worth asking, at least." The hope that blossomed in Winifred's chest was almost painful in its intensity. "I will. Thank you, Sheriff." He stood to leave, but paused at the parlor entrance. "Town's having a social on Saturday night. Nothing fancy, just some music and dancing at the schoolhouse. Thought you might like to know." His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. Good way to meet folks. After he departed, Winifred remained seated, her mind whirling with possibilities. For the first time since receiving Winston Carmichael's rejection, she allowed herself to imagine a future in Sonora not as someone's mail-order bride, but as her own woman. The following day, Winston Carmichael arrived at the sheriff's office precisely at noon, his face a mask of cold civility, as he counted out $200 in front of Winifred. She accepted the money with quiet dignity, signing the document Sheriff Kent had prepared, releasing Carmichael from their marriage contract. "I wish you well, Miss O'Malley," Carmichael said stiffly, tipping his hat before departing. Once he was gone, Winifred carefully folded the bills and placed them in her reticule. "I never expected to see that money," she admitted to Kent. "In Boston, a woman in my position would have little recourse. Sonora may be rough around the edges, but we try to be fair," Kent replied, leaning against his desk. "What will you do now?" "I spoke with Mr. Jenkins this morning. He's agreed to let me use a corner of his store for dressmaking and alterations. I'll pay him 20% of my earnings." Her face brightened with excitement. "I've already received my first commission. Mrs. Holloway needs a new Sunday dress." Kent smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "That's excellent news. I'm glad you're staying in Sonora." "As am I," Winifred replied softly. Their eyes held for a moment, and she felt that same strange flutter return to her chest. The town social on Saturday night was held in the one-room schoolhouse, transformed for the evening with oil lamps and wildflowers arranged in mason jars. A fiddle and banjo duo provided lively music as couples spun across the wooden floor. Winifred stood near the refreshment table, her heart pounding with nervousness. She debated attending at all, conscious of how her scars might set her apart, but Mrs. Holloway had insisted. "Can't hide yourself away forever, girl," the landlady had declared, helping Winifred arrange her hair to frame her face. "This town's seen worse than a few burn scars. Believe me." She had worn her best dress, a deep blue, that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, and positioned herself strategically so that her unmarred left side faced most of the room. Several women had introduced themselves, curious about the newcomer, but the men largely kept their distance, stealing glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Sheriff Kent arrived an hour after the dancing began, his tall frame commanding attention as he entered the schoolhouse. He'd traded his usual attire for clean dark trousers and a pressed white shirt. Though his gun belt remained at his hip, a sheriff was never truly off duty. His eyes scanned the room until they found Winifred, and he made his way directly to her side. "Miss O'Malley," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "I'm glad you decided to come." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "Large gatherings still make me uncomfortable." His gaze swept over her face, taking in both the smooth skin of her left side and the scarred tissue of her right without flinching. "Would it help to know that half the men in this room are working up the courage to ask you to dance?" She laughed softly, disbelieving. "I think you're being kind, Sheriff." "Keenan," he corrected her. "And I'm being truthful. You're the most interesting person to arrive in Sonora in months." He offered his hand as the musicians began a waltz. "May I have this dance?" Winifred hesitated, her hand hovering above his. "People will stare." "Let them," he replied simply. "I only care what you think." With a deep breath, she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. His right hand settled respectfully at her waist as his left held hers, and they began to move with the music. To her surprise, Sheriff Kent was a skilled dancer, guiding her smoothly across the floor. "Where did a frontier lawman learn to waltz?" she asked, relaxing slightly as they found their rhythm. "West Point," he answered, "before I resigned my commission." "You were a soldier," he nodded. "Cavalry. Spent 4 years chasing Apaches across the territory before I realized there had to be a better way." His eyes darkened with memory. "Hung up my uniform and took this job instead." "Is that how you got the scar?" she asked, nodding toward the thin line on his face. "This?" His fingers touched it briefly. "No. This was from a knife fight in a saloon my first year as sheriff. The man objected to being arrested for beating his wife." Winifred studied his face, noting the compassion beneath his stern exterior. "You care deeply about justice." "I try." He guided her through a turn, his movements confident without being controlling. "What about you, Miss O'Malley? What does Winifred care deeply about?" The question caught her off guard. Since the fire, she had focused merely on survival, on rebuilding some semblance of a life from the ashes of her old one. What did she truly care about? Creating beautiful things, I suppose, she answered finally. Bringing order from chaos with needle and thread. And, she hesitated, then continued, and being seen for who I am, not just what happened to me. Kent's eyes held hers, and in them she saw understanding that went beyond mere sympathy. I see you, Winifred O'Malley, he said quietly. I see your strength. The music ended, but neither moved immediately to separate. Around them, other couples were already preparing for the next dance, but for a moment they remained in their own world, connected by something neither could quite name. Later that night, as Keenan walked Winifred back to the boarding house, they paused beneath a sky brilliant with stars. The spring air carried the scent of desert sage and distant rain. I never saw stars like this in Boston, Winifred remarked, gazing upward. The city lights dimmed them. That's one thing we have plenty of out here, Keenan replied. Sky and space. And opportunity, she added softly. Thank you for encouraging me to stay, Sheriff Keenan. He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. Sonora needs people like you, Winifred, people with courage and vision. His voice dropped lower. And so do I. The confession hung between them, unexpected and powerful. Winifred felt her pulse quicken as Keenan took a step closer, his intentions clear in his eyes. But as he moved to kiss her, she turned her head slightly, presenting him with her scarred profile. This is who I am, she whispered. This is what you would be choosing. Keenan's hand rose to gently cup her damaged cheek, his thumb brushing the ridged skin with remarkable tenderness. I see only strength here, he said, his voice rough with emotion. The strength to survive, to begin again, to face each day with courage. Then he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that contained both question and promise. Winifred answered by sliding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer as the stars blazed overhead. When they finally parted, breathless and slightly stunned by the intensity of their connection, Keenan rested his forehead against hers. I should go, he murmured. Mrs. Holloway will have my badge if I keep you out past a respectable hour. Winifred laughed softly. She does guard her boarders' reputations fiercely. At the boarding house door, they exchanged another brief kiss before Winifred slipped inside, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The following weeks brought both challenges and triumphs as Winifred established herself in Sonora. Her corner of Jenkins's dry goods store quickly became a destination for the women of the town, who discovered that the newcomer with the scarred face had an exceptional eye for style and fit. Word spread to outlying ranches, bringing customers from as far as 20 miles away. Keenan visited whenever his duties allowed, sometimes bringing small gifts, a bolt of fabric from a passing peddler, wildflowers gathered during his patrols, books ordered from Tucson. Their courtship progressed steadily, each discovering in the other a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from ashes. In early June, as summer heat settled over the territory, Winifred received an unexpected visitor while working at her sewing table in the store. The bell above the door jingled, and she looked up to find a young woman with honey blonde hair and perfect porcelain skin standing hesitantly in the entrance. Miss O'Malley? The visitor asked, her voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern finishing schools. Yes, Winifred confirmed, setting aside her work. How may I help you? The young woman stepped forward, her expensive traveling suit marking her as a stranger to Sonora. My name is Victoria Carmichael. Winston Carmichael is my husband. Winifred's heart sank. So Carmichael had indeed found his suitable young woman from Santa Fe. The girl couldn't be more than 20, with a face as flawless as a china doll's. Mrs. Carmichael, Winifred acknowledged with as much dignity as she could muster. What brings you to my shop? Victoria twisted her gloved hands together nervously. I wanted to meet you. To apologize for my husband's behavior. He told me what happened. That isn't necessary, Winifred began, but Victoria interrupted. Yes, it is. What Winston did was cruel and unjust. I didn't know about you when I accepted his proposal. Her blue eyes filled with tears. "I've been so unhappy since learning the truth. The man I married is not the man I thought he was." Winifred's initial resentment softened at the genuine distress in the younger woman's face. "Please sit down," she offered, pulling up a chair. "Would you like some water?" Victoria accepted gratefully, removing her gloves to reveal slender hands marred by a wedding ring that appeared too heavy for her delicate fingers. As they talked, Winifred learned that the young woman had been married to Carmichael for barely 3 weeks, long enough to discover his controlling nature and cruel streak. "He forbids me from speaking to the ranch hands," Victoria confided. "Says they're beneath my station, and when I suggested inviting neighbors for dinner, he laughed and said most of the ranchers nearby weren't fit company for a lady of my breeding." "Why are you telling me this?" Winifred asked gently. Victoria lifted her chin, a spark of determination flashing through her tears. "Because I'm leaving him. My father sent me with a personal account that Winston knows nothing about. I'm taking the stage to Tucson tomorrow, then the train east." She hesitated. "I wanted to make things right with you first, and to ask your advice about surviving on one's own." Winifred was silent for a long moment, considering the young woman before her. In many ways, Victoria reminded her of herself 3 years earlier, sheltered, frightened, but finding unexpected reserves of courage. "The world isn't as frightening as we're taught to believe," Winifred finally said. "There are good people willing to help if you're brave enough to ask. And there's tremendous freedom in building your own life." Relief flooded Victoria's face. "That's what I hoped you'd say." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I brought this for you. It isn't enough to make up for what Winston did, but it might help your business grow." Inside the pouch was $500 in banknotes, a small fortune in the Arizona Territory. "I can't accept this," Winifred protested. "Please," Victoria insisted. "It's my money, not his, and I'd rather it help someone build something good than sit in a bank while I return to my parents' home." After Victoria left, promising to write once she was safely back east, Winifred sat motionless at her workbench, the pouch of money before her. Life had taken such unexpected turns since she'd first stepped off the stagecoach in Sonora. What had begun as humiliation and rejection had somehow transformed into opportunity and even love. When Keenan arrived that evening to escort her to dinner, Winifred shared Victoria Carmichael's visit and gift. "What do you think I should do with it?" she asked as they walked along Sonora's dusty main street. Keenan considered the question carefully. "The mercantile next to the assay office is closing. Owner's heading to California for his lungs. Might be a good location for a proper dress shop." Winifred's eyes widened at the suggestion. "My own shop? That's a big step from a corner in Jenkins's store." "Sonora's growing," Keenan replied. "Railroad's talking about adding a spur line next year. Town council's approved plans for a proper courthouse." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "This place is going to thrive, Winifred. Why shouldn't you thrive with it?" The conviction in his voice made her smile. "You really believe in me, don't you?" "In you. In us." He took her hands in his. "Which brings me to something I've been meaning to ask." Winifred's heart began to race as Keenan dropped to one knee in the middle of the street, heedless of the dust that immediately coated his trousers. "Winifred O'Malley," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I've known since the moment you stood in my office with your chin held high that you were the bravest woman I had ever met. I love your strength, your determination, and your heart." He squeezed her hands gently. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Winifred's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Keenan rose and wrapped his arms around her, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that spoke of both tenderness and passion. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted when he finally set her down. Winifred laughed through her tears. "I don't need a ring. I just need you." They were married on a clear September morning in 1885, with half of Sonora in attendance. The ceremony took place in the small whitewashed church at the edge of town, with Mrs. Holloway dabbing at her eyes in the front pew, and Mr. Jenkins proudly giving away the bride. Winifred wore a dress of her own creation, ivory satin with delicate lace that she'd painstakingly sewn herself. She'd designed the neckline to rise higher on her right side, complementing rather than concealing her scars. When she walked down the aisle, she held her head high, her hair arranged to frame both sides of her face equally. Keenan waited at the altar in a new black suit, his badge polished but still pinned to his vest, a symbol of the responsibility he carried even on this most personal of days. When Winifred reached him, he took both her hands in his eyes shining with a love that saw past surface to soul. "You're beautiful," he whispered as the minister began the ceremony. They exchanged simple vows in plain gold bands, promising to honor and cherish one another through all of life's challenges. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Keenan cupped Winifred's face in his hands, both the smooth side and the scarred, and kissed her with such tenderness that several ladies in the congregation sighed audibly. The celebration afterward spilled from the churchyard into the town square, with tables laden with food contributed by every household in Sonora. A band played while children darted between the adults, and as the afternoon sun began to lower, Keenan led Winifred in their first dance as husband and wife. "Happy, Mrs. Kent?" he murmured against her ear as they swayed to the music. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing me, truly seeing me when others couldn't." His arms tightened around her. "I see the most beautiful, courageous woman I've ever known, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it." As they danced beneath the golden Arizona sky, Winifred reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fire that had scarred her body had also forged her spirit, preparing her for a life she could never have imagined in her sheltered Boston existence. In seeking a husband through a mail-order advertisement, she had instead found herself, and in being rejected for her scars, she had discovered the man who saw them as badges of honor rather than marks of shame. Their new home was a modest house on the outskirts of town, close enough for Keenan to reach the sheriff's office quickly if needed, but with enough land for a garden and perhaps someday, children. Winifred had used part of Victoria's gift to purchase the mercantile, transforming it into Winifred's fine apparel and alterations, while investing the remainder in their home. Life as a sheriff's wife brought its own challenges. There were nights when Keenan was called away to handle disturbances or track outlaws, leaving Winifred alone with her worries. But there were also peaceful evenings on their porch, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in impossible colors while planning their future together. In December, as winter brought cooler temperatures to the territory, Winifred's shop hosted a holiday gathering for the women of Sonora. As she served spiced cider and displayed her newest fabrics, she caught sight of her reflection in the store's front window, a confident woman with her scarred profile clearly visible, surrounded by friends who saw her for who she truly was. Later that night, as she and Keenan prepared for bed in their cozy bedroom, she shared the realization with him. "I never have to hide anymore," she said softly as she brushed her hair at the dressing table. "Not my face, not my thoughts, not my dreams. You gave me that freedom." Keenan came to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "You gave it to yourself, Winnie. I just had the good sense to recognize what was right in front of me." He bent to kiss the top of her head. "The strongest, most beautiful woman in the Arizona territory." She rose and turned into his embrace. "I have something to tell you," she whispered against his chest. "Something wonderful." Leaning back to see his face, she took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Keenan. In summer." His expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. "A baby," he repeated, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Are you certain?" Winifred nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears. "Dr. Morgan confirmed it yesterday. We're going to be parents." Keenan lifted her in his arms, spinning her around with a whoop of joy before carefully setting her back on her feet. "A baby," he said again, his hand returning to her stomach with reverent gentleness. "Our child." "I was afraid at first," Winifred admitted, "afraid of what might happen if the baby has my scars, or if complications arise because of the damage to my body." Keenan's expression grew serious. "Dr. Morgan doesn't think there's any risk to you or the baby because of your scars, does he?" "No, he says I'm perfectly healthy. The scarring is only on the surface." She took a deep breath. "But I was still afraid until I realized something important. Our child will have two parents who understand that true beauty comes from overcoming challenges, who see strength where others might see flaws." Keenan gathered her close again, his heartbeat strong against her cheek. "Our child will know nothing but love and acceptance, Winnie. I promise you that." As they held each other in the quiet of their bedroom, Winifred felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The journey from frightened, rejected mail-order bride to beloved wife and expectant mother had not been easy, but every step had led her exactly where she was meant to be. Spring brought new growth to Sonora as wildflowers carpeted the desert, and Winifred's body changed with her advancing pregnancy. Her shop continued to thrive under the part-time management of Mrs. Holloway's niece, allowing Winifred to balance her work with preparation for the baby. One evening in May, as she and Keenan sat on their porch watching the sunset, a dust cloud on the horizon announced an approaching rider. Keenan stood, his hand instinctively moving to the gun he wore even at home. "Stay here," he instructed, moving to the edge of the porch as the rider came into view. To their surprise, the horseman proved to be a messenger from Tucson, bearing a letter addressed to Mrs. Winifred Kent. After the messenger had been paid and sent on his way with an invitation to refresh himself in town, Winifred opened the envelope with curious fingers. The letter was from Victoria Carmichael, now Victoria Langley, once again writing from her parents' home in Philadelphia. "My dear Mrs. Kent," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well and thriving in Sonora. I have thought of you often since our brief meeting last year and wanted to share some news that might interest you. Winston Carmichael has lost the Double Circle Ranch. His creditors finally caught up with him, and the property was sold at auction last month. I confess I felt a certain satisfaction upon hearing this news, though I take no pleasure in anyone's misfortune." Winifred continued reading aloud to Keenan. "I have found my own happiness at last. My parents initially insisted I remain quietly at home as the grieving widow. I allowed Winston's family to believe he had died rather than face the scandal of our separation. But I have recently begun teaching at a school for girls from difficult circumstances. Many of my students bear physical or emotional scars not unlike your own, and I often think of your courage when helping them see their own worth. Thank you for showing me, however briefly, what true strength looks like." The letter concluded with warm wishes for their happiness and an invitation to correspond further if Winifred wished. She folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope, her expression thoughtful. "So Carmichael lost everything," Keenan remarked, settling back beside her. "Can't say I'm surprised. He always spent more than he earned, trying to impress the right people." "I don't wish him ill," Winifred said softly, "but I can't help feeling that justice has been served in its own way." She placed a hand on her rounded belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm. "And Victoria seems to have found her purpose. I'm glad for her." Keenan covered her hand with his own. "You know, if Carmichael hadn't rejected you that day, none of this would have happened. You wouldn't have your shop. We wouldn't have found each other. This little one wouldn't be on the way." He smiled at the irony. "Sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead to the best." "I was thinking the same thing," Winifred admitted. "It's strange to be grateful for something that hurt so deeply at the time." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the first stars appearing in the vast Arizona sky. Winifred leaned against her husband's solid shoulder, content in a way she'd never imagined possible when she'd first stepped off that stagecoach a year earlier. On a scorching July morning in 1886, Winifred gave birth to a healthy baby boy after 18 hours of labor. Keenan paced outside their bedroom until Dr. Morgan finally emerged with the news, then rushed to his wife's side to find her tired but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "Meet your son," Winifred whispered as Keenan knelt beside the bed, his eyes wide with wonder. Kenneth William Kent. The baby's face was perfect tiny features, a dusting of dark hair, his father's cleft chin already evident. When he opened his eyes, they were the same storm gray as Keenan's, blinking up at his parents with solemn curiosity. "He's beautiful," Keenan breathed, gently touching the infant's cheek with one finger. "Just like his mother." Winifred's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Would you like to hold him?" With trembling hands, Keenan accepted his son, cradling the tiny body against his chest with a tenderness that made Winifred's heart swell. "Hello, Kenneth," he murmured. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you." The baby yawned, his tiny fist escaping the blanket to wrap around his father's finger with surprising strength. Keenan looked up at Winifred, his own eyes suspiciously damp. "He's perfect, Winnie. Absolutely perfect." As summer turned to fall, little Kenneth thrived under his parents' devoted care. Winifred adapted to motherhood with the same determination she had applied to every challenge in her life, while Keenan proved to be a doting father who thought nothing of walking the floor with a fussing infant so his wife could rest. The town of Sonora embraced its newest citizen wholeheartedly. Mrs. Holloway appointed herself honorary grandmother, arriving regularly with knitted blankets and unsolicited advice. Mr. Jenkins crafted a beautiful wooden cradle as a gift, and even Dr. Morgan stopped by more often than strictly necessary for medical reasons, clearly charmed by the sheriff's son. On Kenneth's 3-month birthday, Winifred reopened her shop full-time, bringing the baby with her in a basket that sat beside her sewing table. Customers cooed over the infant while conducting their business, and more than one rough cowboy was observed making silly faces when he thought no one was looking. Life fell into a new rhythm early mornings with Kenneth. Busy days balancing motherhood and work, evenings as a family when Keenan's duties allowed. There were challenges, of course, nights when the baby wouldn't sleep, days when Keenan faced danger in the line of duty, moments when running a business and a household simultaneously seemed impossible. But through it all, Winifred and Keenan's bond only strengthened. They faced each obstacle together, supporting one another with unwavering faith and love. And in quiet moments, when Kenneth slept peacefully and they had time to simply be husband and wife, they marveled at the journey that had brought them together. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Keenan surprised Winifred with a silver locket containing a tiny photograph of the three of them, taken by a traveling photographer who had passed through Sonora the previous month. "To replace the one you lost when you first arrived," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. "A new family heirloom to pass down through the generations." Winifred touched the locket gently, tears blurring her vision. "It's perfect," she whispered, leaning up to kiss him. "Thank you for making me part of a family again." Keenan drew her into his arms, his expression serious. "You know, I've been thinking about the future, about what kind of life we want to build for Kenneth and any brothers or sisters who might come along." "Oh," Winifred raised an eyebrow. "And what have you been thinking, Sheriff Kent?" "That maybe it's time for a change." He led her to the porch swing, pulling her down beside him. "The railroad's coming through next year for certain now. Town's growing faster than anyone expected. Council's talking about hiring more deputies, maybe even a proper police force eventually." "Are you worried about the changes?" Winifred asked. He shook his head. "Not worried, just wondering if there might be other ways to serve Sonora besides wearing this badge." His fingers touched the silver star on his vest. "I've been offered a position on the Territorial Council, representative for Sonora and the surrounding county." Winifred's eyes widened. "That's a tremendous honor, Keenan." "It would mean less danger," he continued, "more regular hours, time with you and Kenneth." His eyes held hers. "But it would also mean you'd be married to a politician instead of a lawman." Think you could tolerate that?" She laughed, leaning against his shoulder. "I think I could manage, especially if it means not wondering if you'll come home safely each night." Her expression grew more serious. "Is this what you want truly? I know how much being sheriff means to you." Keenan was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I became sheriff to help make Sonora a place where decent folks could live in peace. Maybe serving on the council is just another way to do that, helping shape the laws instead of just enforcing them." He squeezed her hand. "And yes, I want more time with my family. Kenneth's growing so fast already, I don't want to miss a moment." "Then I think you should accept," Winifred said softly. "You'd be wonderful in the position." He kissed her temple. "We'd make the decision together. It affects all of us." "Together," she agreed, "as we've done everything since the day you walked me to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house." As they sat on their porch, watching the stars emerge above the desert landscape, Winifred reflected on how completely her life had transformed in the span of 18 months. She had arrived in Sonora with nothing but hope and the promise of a new beginning, only to have that promise shattered by a man who could see only her scars. Instead, she had found strength within herself that she never knew existed. She had built a successful business, found love with a man who saw her true beauty, created a family that filled her heart with joy. The scars that had once seemed like a curse had become merely one part of a rich and complex life, a reminder of what she had survived and overcome. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Winifred caught Keenan watching her with a tender expression. "What is it?" she asked, pausing and brushing her hair. He crossed the room to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror as he had countless times before. His hands came to rest gently on her shoulders, thumbs brushing the scarred skin of her neck with familiar affection. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am," he said softly. "That stagecoach brought me the greatest gift of my life when it delivered you to Sonora." Winifred turned to face him, rising on tiptoes to kiss him with all the love in her heart. "And I found the one man in the world who could look at me and say, 'I see only strength.'" As they held each other in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, the desert wind whispering around their little house, Winifred knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home, not in a place, but in the arms of a man who loved her completely, scars and all. 5 years later, on a bright spring morning in 1891, Winifred stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Keenan helped 5-year-old Kenneth mount his new pony. Their 3-year-old daughter, Margaret, danced around them, her dark curls bouncing as she begged for her turn. "Patience, Maggie," Winifred called, shifting the weight of 6-month-old James in her arms. "Your brother's just learning. You'll have your chance soon." Sonora had grown into a proper town now, with a railroad station, a brick courthouse where Councilman Kent maintained an office, and a 2-story building on Main Street that housed Winifred Kent's Emporium, no longer just a dress shop, but a thriving business selling quality clothing, fabrics, and household linens. The scars on Winifred's face had faded somewhat with time, though they would always be part of her. She no longer thought of them daily. They were simply one aspect of her appearance, like her hazel eyes or the strands of silver beginning to appear in her honey-brown hair. Kenneth had her eyes and Keenan's determined chin. Margaret had inherited her father's storm-gray gaze and her mother's gentle spirit. Little James was still discovering his own unique blend of his parents' traits, though his joyful temperament was already evident. As she watched her family, Winifred's hand rose to touch the silver locket that rarely left her neck. Inside were now 3 photographs, the original of their family of 3, joined by newer images as their family had grown. It was a tangible reminder of the journey that had brought her to this moment of complete happiness. Keenan looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, the same one that had first warmed her heart in a dusty sheriff's office, still had the power to make her breath catch. He said something to Kenneth, then crossed the yard to join her on the porch. "Everything all right?" he asked, gently touching baby James's cheek before slipping an arm around Winifred's waist. "Everything is perfect," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "I was just thinking about how fortunate we are." Keenan's eyes, a little more lined now, but still bright with the same integrity and kindness, held hers. "I think about that every day. How one stagecoach, one moment of courage from a remarkable woman, changed everything." Winifred smiled, remembering the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stage, uncertain of her future. "We've come a long way from that day at Weaver's General Store." "And we've got a long way still to go, Mrs. Kent," Keenan replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "A lifetime together, raising these children, watching Sonora grow, growing old side by side." "I can't think of anything I'd want more," Winifred said softly. As they stood together watching their children, the Arizona sun warm on their faces and the future stretching bright before them, Winifred knew that the most beautiful journeys often began with the most difficult steps. Her scars had led her to rejection, but that rejection had ultimately guided her to acceptance, love, and a life richer than anything she could have imagined. In the end, it wasn't about hiding her scars or pretending they didn't exist. It was about finding the strength within them and the people who could see that strength clearly, even when she couldn't see it herself. And in Keenan Kent, she had found the man who had looked past appearances to her true self from that very first day. The man who had seen not damaged goods, but a woman of remarkable courage. The man who had changed her life with 7 simple words. "I see only strength."